So this first video of 2023 is a difficult one for me. It has to do with finding the heart to create after you've had a loss, after you've lost something that's greatly important, a person or a thing, or in my case, it was my little Jack Russell Terrier I had to say goodbye to a week before Christmas. He got very sick Thanksgiving and just continued to go downhill. And it was finally very, very, very clear when I had to rush into the emergency vet that it was the right thing to do and the right time to do it. So that being said, I have had some projects that I had been working on and some projects that I needed to start. And my heart just wasn't in it. I couldn't find within me the the desire to even pick up my paintbrush. So that is what I want to show you, kind of how I started, and I'm still processing through that. But before I talk more about that, I want to just say how thankful I am for the friends and the family and all my followers on social media who have reached out and said kind words and comforting words. And there were a few people that were very, very thoughtful. I just didn't even expect it, and so it just brought tears each time. And the first one was my coworker had brought me on my break. She brought me a little packet, and it was a little bracelet inside that said, "I am with you always." And that's a verse from Joshua about how God never leaves or forsakes us. And that's a great comfort always, because he's always here. And also, this is something that I can wear that reminds me that in spirit, my little puppy is still here. He's in my heart and in my memories. And that's very, very special. The second one, and this isn't in any particular order, but one of the other things that one of my coworkers did was to bring me a beautiful bunch of purple Ostromeria. And again, it was on my break. And that brought me to tears. I had to go in the janitor's closet and dry my eyes because it touched my heart so much. But then my sister also sent me a sweet, sweet gift, which was a little, and I'll show you these in a minute, was a little angel holding a puppy and little cutout paw prints in her gown and a tea light that sits behind that and lights the prints up. And that was so, so sweet. The next one I have in my hand is a gift that another coworker got me. And she went on my social media and stole all these pictures of my little guy and had him put onto a coffee cup for me. So such thoughtful gifts, and they mean the world to me. So I just wanted to thank them on YouTube for, just for thinking of me and, carrying me through with their comforting words and sweet gifts. So, let me show you the other things. This was the little angel, you see, and there's a little tea light behind it, and she's carrying a sweet puppy. And then the flowers are there behind me. You can see such a beautiful little bunch of Ostromeria. And those things, again, I just wanted to show you because they were so sweet and so meaningful to me. But I really had a difficult time, like I said, even trying to pick up a paintbrush and start. But the first thing that I did was, I'm not going to show you this because it's what I'm going to do the video on, was I did a little painting from a drawing of the back of Benny's head. That's one of my favorite views, and I'll show you that in a minute when we get started on this video. But that was very therapeutic. I wanted to send a special something to my vet and to the emergency vet for all their compassionate care over the years and over the last visits that I went to the emergency vet. Anyway, and then the flowers, that was the second thing that I painted. And it had, a special meaning because it was the gift. And I'll show you that. That's the painting that I did from the Ostramaria flowers. And that was really therapeutic for me as well. So let me set that aside and show you the third thing is I started an oil. I'm traditionally or mostly a watercolor artist, but I have dabbled in oil a bit. And so I wanted to do an oil of my little guy. And isn't that sweet? I just love it. And that's only the second layer. I have a long way to go to finish that. So, all that being said, thanks for listening. It's pouring my heart out to you guys, and thank you for all of your support in, my YouTube channel and all your kind words for, the work that I've done on that channel. Anyway, so let's get started with this video. And before I stop this part, I want to say that those little paintings are how I have processed through that grief. And I feel like I'm kind of coming out the other side where I can do some more of what I've done before, which is, watercolor and some floral paintings and different things like that. But I'm finally kind of feeling that my heart is a little bit put back together enough to start creating some of those things again. I hope that helps you guys to, if you're going through any kind of a loss, just to find a way to process through it. It's very important. We can't just stay consumed by the grief. We have to find a way to push forward, and it's really important. So hope that helps you guys. Hey, don't forget to hit subscribe and to like this video. Really helps my channel, and I totally appreciate you guys. Thanks so much. Let's dive in. Okay, so here we are at my easel, and I've got little Benny Mode taped down to my board here, and I am working on, now I've heard this pronounced differently recently, so I'm going to say arsh. That's the pronunciation that I've been hearing lately. I've always called it arches. I think either way we know what it is. Arsh or arches. Arches is the paper I'm working on. So I've got a tiny little palette here, and I'm going to be working with just a more limited palette on this. There's not a lot of color in him. So I've got some raw sienna, some quinacridone burnt orange, burnt sienna, alizarin. These two are already on here. I'm not sure what they are. Some version of red. I've got ultramarine blue light, Hooker's green, and these two I'm not really sure what they are either. I think I might have a royal blue on there, but for the most part I've squeezed out fresh for the ones that I'm going to be using mostly in this painting. So I also may throw in a little buff titanium because I really am having fun with this color. I really like it a lot, so we'll see how that goes. But, and also, both of these are Princeton Velvet Touch brushes. This is a 4 round and a 2 round, not long rounds, but they're just your basic round brushes. So here's my iPad, and I've got my image of Benny on there, if you can see without the reflection of the light. he was sitting in between my feet there and looking out, just kind of enjoying the morning. So that is the photo I did the sketch from. So I'm using that for the most part for my reference because I want to do the black and white sketch in color. And this is about a 5.5 by 7.5. This is going to allow me room to adjust where I want the matting and frame to go. So I'll start with my burnt sienna right here, and I've got a little bit of the ultramarine light blue. And those two are going to give me some grays that I'm going to need for some of the deeper shadows in his fur. But for the ears, I'm going to start with pretty much the burnt sienna, and I'm going to grab a little of that raw sienna because that's going to give me some of the lighter areas of his fur. So let's get started. I'm going to start with that raw sienna just right here, and I'm working on dry paper, like I said, and just going to start with some of these lines. And I've put that color down. I'm going to extend it with the tip of my brush, and then I can add a little bit of, just drop in a little bit of that burnt sienna. And I want to soften this edge right here. I don't want that hard. So I'm just going to drag my clean brush along the bottom of that and extend it out. And then while this is still wet, I can put in a little of the deeper shadow, a little bit more of the burnt sienna in there, and add that little touch of deeper value to that area. And then this is still wet, so I can feather this out a little bit. He's got some white fur. Mix a little burnt sienna with the raw sienna there and come down. I'm going to leave a little line of white there and just feather this out to take some of that water off my brush and just leave some white areas too, because his fur has a lot of white in it. So that's my little ear. Grab a little more burnt sienna there and come up here into the shadowy area of his ear, and just starting with that darker value. I forgot to put the little line there, and picking up a little bit of the lighter value and rinse my brush and just soften this in there. And then I can come, I think I'll add a touch of alizarin to that, so brighten up that color a little bit of the raw sienna in there. And then I'm just gonna come, that might be a little too red actually. And soften that. I rinsed my brush, and then I come back and soften a little more of that raw sienna in there. And I'm going to feather with the tip of that brush some of these. While that's still wet, I can come up here and just feather out this. One of the things I loved about him was he had these little tufts of fur on his ear. And let's add a little burnt orange. Burnt orange, alizarin, and the blue. So blue and alizarin make a really nice purple, and then adding the burnt orange to that deepens the that to kind of a chocolatey, almost brown. I really like that. And still pretty, it's not wet, but it's enough to just kind of still soften some of those edges. So I'm gonna keep working with that. And I'm gonna leave that alone for a minute and come over here and start this little ear. And not a lot of paint on my brush. And then I just rinsed it and coming back and softening and adding some water. And then I'm coming right back with my burnt sienna mixture and dropping that in. And it's gonna be softer because the paper is still wet and the paint can flow around a bit. So I've got a little softer edge because of that. And then I'm just gonna come in with my raw sienna and add a little bit more of that color. And rinsing my brush, dabbing off the excess water, and softening those lines. And a little bit of gray right in here. One thing to think about is the subtle variations of color. So I felt like there was a bit of a shadow, so I got more of my ultramarine mixture and added that. To this area because it was just a little bit more in the shadow. So also, I've got a little bit of, his fur was dark. He had some dark markings. So I'm going to grab a little bit more of that blue, ultramarine light, mix it with my burnt sienna and a little bit of hooker's green. I think I'll start mixing it over here a little bit more. So change my mind. I'm going to go hooker's green, ultramarine light, and that's maybe a little bit too watery, but I'm going to add that third color to my puddle, and that red and green and blue combination give me a dark. Basically, I don't use a lot of black. I mix my own darks. So that's what I'm doing here, and I'm just adjusting as I go. So there's a little bit more red in there. I'm going to drag in a touch more green. And with a scrap of paper, I want to see if that's about a neutral dark. That doesn't have any one of the three colors that are standing out particularly. So I can actually use what's on my brush and kind of actually rinsed it off a little bit, and I'm just going to add a touch of water to that. And then very gently touch in a little bit of that black. And we can strengthen that later. Same thing over here. We've got some dark. So I've added a little bit of water, and I'm just going to start bringing that down. Let's just come all the way down into here because that all is black too. I'm going to leave a little bit of dry paper here. So when I'm adding this black, I've got wet paper, and hopefully this paint mixture is thick enough, but if not, we can come back and strengthen it. So that's got a little bit more green than I wanted. So I just adjusted that a little bit more. I'm going to come up here and just touching lightly with the tip of my brush, because I don't want to fill in every little spot because there's white hairs. And we're gonna use a little trick at the end to get some of those white hairs back, since you don't, unless I saved it. I could have saved it with masking fluid, but I didn't do that. So we've got a highlight here, very subtle, but I'm gonna just leave that a little bit lighter and feather this out a little bit so we've got some of that fur. Doesn't have to go all in the same direction. You can kind of flip out a couple of those and it looks a little bit more realistic that way. And let's continue up in here. I'm going to rinse my brush off and grab a little bit more burnt sienna because there is some brown in here. Rinse off some of that and add some brown, burnt sienna. All right, so I'm liking that. First layer, we've got a lot of nice contrast and color happening. One reason I like to mix my own blacks is because they're not as flat when you mix them yourself. The tube blacks can tend to be a little on the flat side, so they don't have color in them. So if you mix your own, you know, you can make it a bluer black, you can make it a browner black, you can make it have a little bit more interest than just a straight out of the tube. All right, so I'm liking that. I'm gonna leave that alone. And start with some of these shadows in the fur, some of those little subtle variations. So I'm going to grab some of this gray. This is where I want the buff titanium. Add a little bit of that to my palette. And it just has a, I tried mixing something similar, thinking that, oh, I could probably just kind of fake it and get that color from some of the ones I already had, but it's not the same. It's got a really granular texture if you mix it with a lot of water. Let's get a little of this. It's not that brown, but there's just a little bit of his skin showing through up here, so having a touch of that kind of peachy color. Let's add a little bit more of that buff titanium to that. And again, remember, you don't have to have the fur all like, let me show you. So don't do this. Vary it up, kind of, you know, looks more like fur. If you do it like little soldiers, it just looks like you're gonna do a counting thing. So try to vary up those brush strokes and the color. Let's add a little bit more blue up here to that buff. You know, another little color that I like adding into shadows is more of a purple. So we've got that with our alizarin there. A little bit of buff. And let's just do that down here. A little bit of water in there so it kind of spreads around a little bit more. A little bit more of the buff. White fur is fun because you can use the color that's surrounding to add some variation. So for instance, there's a little bit of shadow under there. For instance, you've got green plants kind of around, so you can maybe get a little bit of green into it. Let's see how that is. Just have a little bit of fun and add some color. A little bit of raw sienna for some sunlit spots. Soften some of these edges. They've kind of settled into the paper, so they're going to not move as much, but you'll get a little bit of a softening. And there's a little bit of dark fur that's coming underneath his collar, so let's bring that down. A little bit darker. And I'm going to lift a little bit of that up. I rinsed my brush of the color, and I'm just going to pick up a little bit of that, extended down a little further than I wanted. I'm going to add the buff titanium, just thick over the top of that. All right, so I'm liking that. Wait for that to dry just a little bit more and add a touch. It might be dry enough now. I'm just going to add a very little small touches right up next to his collar. All right, so up here, I'm going to come back with some of the burnt sienna and ultramarine. Might be a little too watery. Let's see. I think I want the burnt orange in there more. A little bit redder. I'm getting that a little bit darker in there. A little bit of that blue. And just darken that up a little bit. And just with the tip of my brush, adding some a little darker strokes. It's still a little bit wet, so it's softening. I'm going to come over here a little bit, down this little line. And while this is still wet, I can just bring in a little bit of raw sienna. Now, this isn't maybe going to show up as much, but I like to do intentional blossoms in spots. Add some texture. So I've just taken all the color off my brush, and I can drop in at the right level of drying time stage and just drop in water. And that should push some of that paint away and cause a blossom. So let's come over here This area of the ear is pretty light, so I don't want to put too much color in that little section, but I want it to be soft next to that portion of the ear. And I'm just going to darken that up a little bit. And same thing. A little bit darker up in here. And a little bit darker up. There we go. So now I've got my brush rinsed, and it's a little bit more on the thirsty side, so I'm not adding water to that. I'm kind of able to feather this out a little bit, so some of that darker value I can drag in and add some texture to his ears. So I rinsed my brush of color, and I feathered out some of the paint that was already there, and then I grabbed a little bit thicker mixture and was able to add some of the fur texture. So let's go here, and I'm going to darken up a couple little areas here. This is dry, so the paint that I'm adding onto that isn't going to spread anywhere. That way I can add a little bit of texture. There's also a little bit of color up in here. There's a little bit on my brush. That might be enough just to get that tan color without getting too dark up there. And then I'm going to add just a, touches here and there of fur, shadow from his fur. So I can add the line, such as there, and then there's a little bit too much water, but then I can soften it. And I'm going to do that right here. A little more of the gray. Just add a little bit of water here and there, and then a thicker bit of paint. Rinsed my brush, and I lifted a little bit of that. I don't want it to get too super dark because it is, after all, white fur. But there is some deeper areas in the fur that I can play with the shadows. Right in here, there's a little bit of dark as well. Soften that a smidge. And then we can let this dry a little bit. I want to come back and work on the collar. So I'm going to let it sit here and dry, and then we'll be back and mix up our purple for that collar. So I've grabbed another color. This is Holbein's Quinacridone Magenta. I was working on mixing up a good, vibrant, kind of a red violet for his collar. And the alizarin just wasn't giving me what I wanted. So I went with an even cooler, which is meaning that this is leaning more toward blue. This is a cool red as well, but it's a little warmer than the magenta. So mixing it with this ultramarine was not giving me the purple I wanted. So I grabbed my Quinacridone Magenta and I started mixing here just so you can see the difference in the... Here's the magenta, or the alizarin, and you can see that's much more red than this. This has a pinker appearance. So I felt like I was going to get a better purple by mixing my magenta quinacridone magenta with my ultramarine blue, and I was correct, because if you can still see this, this is a much more red violet, and this is pretty close in color to what I'm looking for. So I think we can get started on getting his collar on. And there are areas that are lighter, so I'll start with the darker and probably add a little more blue to a corner of that, because in the darker areas, as on the sides there and maybe along his little buckle, is going to be a little bit darker. So now I've rinsed my brush and I'm just coming in with whatever color is left on there. Careful about some of those droplets that form. And I'm going to just even leaving a couple little lighter areas, because there's some highlights in that collar. And so I'm going to just get a little bit of that form. So a little bit darker over here because it's a little bit curved away from the light, and this is picking up a little bit more light. And also you can add a little bit of either the green, because that's gonna deepen that and gray that purple down a little bit as well. So I can just add a little bit of that to my mixture there and just touch it in, and it's gonna be a grayer purple. All right, and over on the other side too, actually, I'm going to start with getting the whole thing fairly wet. It's not like really shiny wet, but it's where there's a little bit of sheen on the paper, it's not puddling. So then I'm going to start on the darker side here. I'm on the dark side. And I'm going to add a touch more blue into that. Blue is cooler, so this part is away from the light hitting it. And then I'm going to rinse my brush and kind of spread that around, encourage that to flow a little bit over into the lighter areas. And then just grabbing a little on my brush and touching in where it's a little bit darker. And this side is a little bit darker, so I'm going to grab some of that grayer, grayed down with the green part. And same thing right here in the middle. Just adding a little bit of water to the paper. So I'm working on wet paper here. And I'm going to touch in a little bit more of the magenta into this section on the right. A little bit more of the grayer, cooler purple onto this side because it's away from the light. So paying attention to those little subtle changes in the color. And just right along this little buckle there, it's going to be a touch darker. So in order to get a soft edge right here, I didn't want that to be too harsh like it was an outline. So I touched in a little bit thicker very carefully along that edge. If I put a watery mixture into a watery mixture, it's going to just flow out and it's not going to give the effect that I was wanting. So having a little bit thicker of a mixture right in here, it's not going to spread as far. Okay. And I can do that still over here because it's a little bit wet still, a little bit damp still. Same thing over here, just touch in a little bit of color. And right along here with this buckle as well, because there's a tiny, tiny shadow under each side of that. And the black is going to be more of a gray because that buckle is more in the light. So we're going to let that little part dry. But I can come over here and get a little bit of the, let me clean this up a little bit, get a little bit of that ultramarine and burnt sienna because we're going to work on that little ring, that silver ring. So grabbing a little ultramarine and a little bit of that burnt sienna, that's going to give me a nice gray. Now I can make it a warmer gray or a cooler gray depending on how much burnt sienna or how much blue. So this is going to be a little bit of a cooler gray. This is going to be a little bit more of a warm gray. And that's important because we're going to get some variation in the shadow, the color of this silver because of where it is on his body. So some of it can be reflecting the light, some of it, and there's a little bit of raw sienna too. Let's put that over here. I haven't even touched this brush. You notice I'm still using the bigger brush. It's got such a nice tip on it that I can go into some of these smaller areas and be just fine. So that's an important thing to note because a lot of times you feel like you've got more control when you go with a smaller brush, but it can kind of take away some of the freshness of your painting when you have too small of a brush and you're kind of trying to work in a big area. It's always better to go with a brush that is a little bit bigger than you're comfortable with. And you get used to it. You get used to working with that. So just very gently adding some of those lines. And we'll come back in and darken some of that up after it dries. So the other thing I want to do now is just touch in a little bit more, and I'm just kind of dabbing this in, getting some of those darker areas. And then what I can do, rinse my brush, get the moisture off, and come and soften those. And this paint has dried on my palette, so just adding a touch of water, I get a thicker mixture. And let's just do a tiny bit over there, a little bit more. So because the paper is dry and this paint is thicker, it's going to dry darker. So in just a couple of spots, I wanted to touch in a little bit more of that thicker paint and darken some of that black up. And here I don't want to lose my highlight, but I can add some little fur texture there. Okay, so this needs to dry, and then I want to add that little buckle onto the collar there. So I'm going to go in the same puddle of black and just come right in there and fill in my collar buckle. This is kind of coming down. It's gonna fairly fade into the fur color there. Rinse my brush off. I'm getting off most of the moisture because there's a lot of paint on here. I'm gonna take some of it off and leaving a little bit of a line there. Because it's like a highlight. So over here I'm gonna do darker on this edge. Rinsing my brush, getting most of the moisture off, and right along the line of paint that I just put down, I'm just gonna let that kind of flow into the wet paper. And there's a little bit of a lost edge there, which is really nice. And I think I'll come right along here. We've got another lost edge, as that black buckle is against the fur that's black, so that's a nice lost edge. That makes for an interesting painting, by the way, when you have some lost and found edges. And now we're getting into where we can add some, and I may go with my smaller brush, we can add some of these more subtle little details. And let's just do that. We'll go to my number 2 round, and I'm gonna get some of that buff titanium and some of this gray that I mixed up. And just, even though this fur is white over here, I'm gonna add a little bit of that gray, and it's like it's in the shadow. Because I'm working on a white paper with a white background, white fur, you have to get creative and figure out a way to make that happen. So most of his fur is going this direction, but just to add a little couple of more interesting pieces, you can flick it out in different ways, even different color. A little bit browner there. And right in here he had kind of a line of where his fur was sticking up in a different direction. And so I'm going to add some of that. Oops. I'm going to add some of that burnt sienna to my little purple puddle there. And over here, he had a little bit more of a fullness. So I'm just gonna play with that a little bit with my buff titanium and just add a little bit of more of a fullness over there. And a little bit more depth of shadow over in here. And I want to be careful because I just came over the top of my little 2 rings there. And I want to do some more detail on that little piece. So I'm going to let that dry for a second. All right, I think that's dry enough. So I'm just going to grab some of this darker paint that I mixed up earlier, and I'm going to add just a little bit of a line very carefully, and I'll get my start and then not keep dabbing for the most part, because then my line will be super crooked. So I'm going to try to do just a solid line like a C curve. And same thing over here, just inside that ring, and a little bit out on the outer edge, a little bit darker in here. And this one needs an outer edge and an inner edge. And I think I'd like to add a little bit more blue. Sky was blue that morning, so there's probably a touch of it in there. It's all that reflected light. And I like a little touch of that raw sienna, maybe with some of the buff. Again, for some of that reflected color. And just making sure all of the parts are completely dry. I'm not going to go too much further on this. I think I've got the character that I loved so much about him. This looks like the back of his head. So I'm going to dry this up and we're going to do some little detail work at the end here. Okay, so let's put this aside, put our magenta away and brushes aside. What I'm going to do, which I love doing, is adding some highlights. I'm going to go back in with this One for All acrylic marker that I love so much, and it is white, so we'll get that all shook up. I'm all shook up. Okay, and then we're going to prime it and get it all ready to go. I'm going to set that aside though, because I want to first do some little line work with this Kiritake brush pen. It's another thing that I've really had fun with. So I'm just going to add, you know, some little darker pieces in spots where there's some more shadow and some more little fur detail. Not to get carried away though. It's very easy, but he wasn't black up in a lot of that area, so I just want to add a couple of little touches and a couple little touches in here. And again, coming and adding a little bit of texture to his fur. Gives a nice effect. Now what I want to be careful of is not to drag my hand across it, because when this marker is still wet, that is very easy to do, and you can't erase it with water like I could with the paint. So I learned from past mistakes that that is something to be careful of. I might add a little bit more brown over there too. And couple little darker flicks here and there. And a little line in here. Careful to put it down where I want it to start. And a little bit of a line here. I'm not adding a lot of pressure to this pen. The more pressure I put when I press down, the thicker that line is going to be. So I want to be careful to keep the line a little bit thinner. But it really goes on smoothly. I could use like a micron marker, but I have to press in a little bit too hard. And then it doesn't give me this nice smooth mark. And let's just give a little indication that there's some fur sticking up in there too. A couple of lines to indicate that there's texture in that. All right, so let's make sure that that's dry before starting in with the white marker, which I think the parts that I'm going to work on are. So there's a couple of little white furs that are coming in various places. So I'm just going to flick a couple of them in there, a couple of them up here. Again, I don't want to get super carried away with doing too much of that, but just having some little white marks of fur is fun. All right, I really feel like that is pretty complete. I don't want to go too far and lose the freshness. So just adding a little touch here and there of this white to the mark, to that little ring, I think is nice. Okay, so the only thing left to do is sign this little puppy, and we're gonna put his little name on it, Lil Benny Mode. And I will sign it up here very small. And on this one, I'm going to put the year, and voila, finished piece. Now, at the end of this, I want to say this was the first, I painted this a couple of times already. I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I did it on 5x7 cards and sent them off to my vet and to the emergency vet. But this was the first thing I painted after I had to say goodbye to this little guy, and it was healing. And then the subsequent paintings that I've done and started have also helped me to begin that healing process. So I say that, and I did this video to kind of encourage those of you who have experienced loss of something or someone very important, to find a way to start that healing process. It's not easy to get back to normal after you've had a loss. So whatever you can do to start that process, and to, for this, it was a way for me to pay tribute to this guy who was with me through some of the hardest places in my life. And so that is my tribute to him, is remembering him in my painting. And that helped heal my heart. So hope that encourages you guys to find that healing, to find that place where you can start to mend and then go forward. And, that's all we can do. So, again, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like this video, and we will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. Take care, you guys. Happy painting. Bye-bye.